Okay, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you here. If you're in Vancouver, the weather looks like it's getting better. It's brightening up a bit, although it's still kind of windy and overcast, but not bad. Not bad. So, who's here? Aliana's here. Good morning, Aliana. Good morning, Manish. Good morning, Karen again. Good morning, Min. Good morning, Mashid. Hello, Ella. Good evening. Adalbert's here. Good morning, Adalbert. Good morning, Ying. Good morning, Pearly. And Luan is here. Good morning, Luan. And good morning, Jenna. Okay. So, as people continue to trickle in, today we'll start China. So we're finished India. We're moving on to China. Um, I will admit that China is an area of the world that I don't know as well historically. Um, when I was doing all my university work, I was a classics minor, and so I took a lot of courses in ancient Greece and Rome, and I have uh, a better background in human evolution and sort of hunter-gatherer life ways and things like that. So that's kind of more on my background, but India and China were places where I wound up not doing a lot of coursework in. So just like India, China will be a bit of a learning experience for me as well, because again, I don't I don't quite know it as well as I know other places in the world. Good morning, Sam. Good morning, Thika. Okay, right. So let's dive in. Okay, and we'll start on this module on China. So, I'll mention this very quickly. The other day, I guess it was on Friday, I asked you to write me a short paragraph on what what part of our studies on India connected to your own life and how. And some people had some really interesting um, connections. A lot of them had to do with Buddhism, because Buddhism, of course, spread throughout parts of China and Southeast Asia, and so lots of you have either an interaction with it or sort of participate in Buddhism, and so that was really kind of interesting to hear about. So thank you for sending that. Okay, so as with all of our other cultures, we're going to try to focus on these things. Okay, so we're going to look at China from the perspective of culture and environment. So how environment is connected to culture and cultural development. Um, we're going to look at politics. So we're going to look at ideas of power and authority and governance. We're going to look at interactions and exchanges. So how this culture has interacted, how Chinese culture has interacted with other places in the world. Um, we'll look at conflict and conflict resolution to the degree that we can. We'll look at values and beliefs of kind of historical Chinese societies. And we'll look at cultural expressions, okay? So, just in case nobody knew where China is, here's where it is. Uh, China, of course, makes up the eastern part of Asia. It's a reasonably large country. Um, I don't know if it's the fourth or fifth largest country in the world or anything like that, but it is a very large country. Um, Currently, there are a huge number of people living in China, but China is also very environmentally diverse, and so again, partly because of its size, there are lots of different climates and environments found within the sort of traditional territory of China. Um, what we should know, of course, is that some of China is coastal, and so you can see along the Yellow Sea and the East and South China Sea. Part of China is coastal, part of it is inland. You can see two of the major river systems there, which we'll talk about shortly, the Yangtze and the Yellow. Um, and of course, China has important borders with Southeast Asia here, and of course with India, and also with Central Asia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia and Siberia in the north. Third largest. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Eliana. Yeah, so it's a big country, and again, it's rather environmentally diverse. And so again, in the south, we have kind of the Himalaya mountain range, and so it's very sort of mountainous and rugged there. Where China connects to Southeast Asia, we have sort of mountainous jungle like you would find in that part of the world. To the west and to the north, you have drier areas. And so there are some areas that are useful for agriculture. And then as you go kind of further north and further west, you start to get dry, open grassland that people tend to have herds of animals living in that part of the world historically. And then at the very north, you have a desert, right? So again, you can see the satellite view of China shows you pretty clearly what types of different environments there are, right? And so you can see lots of moist green area kind of in the southeast part. You can very clearly see the mountainous border that it shares with part of Southeast Asia and with India, the Himalayas. You can see parts of the area that are sort of drier and more open. You can see a desert area there in the kind of northwest. And so you actually have lots of different climates and different environments within China. As a bit of a tangent that's not really important to anything, but if you look at the very top of this image, you'll see a really big lake that kind of looks like a banana. That's actually where I used to work when I was a graduate student. That's Lake Baikal in Russia and Siberia, and I used to work in that part of the world for my grad program. So I never got to go to China, unfortunately. It was kind of on my list of things to do, and I never actually managed to get on a train or a plane and go there. But we were kind of close to it. So anyway, China is a very environmentally and climatically diverse place, right? And so important for the early cultural history of environment are these two river systems, the Yellow and the Yangtze. Of course, that should ring a bell because so far we've looked at Mesopotamia, we've looked at Egypt, we've looked at India, and in all of those areas, we saw that river systems were critically important to the creation of civilizations, right? All of those civilizations grew up and developed around a river system. And so, spoiler alert, the same thing is going to happen in China. The Yellow and the Yangtze are going to be important places where complex civilizations start to occur. And they'll start to occur for many of the same reasons that they appear in Mesopotamia and Egypt and in the Indus Valley. We have a population that's growing and a need to feed people. And the river provides a very consistent source of water and flat land around the river usually in order to grow crops and then water them, right? So again, you see a very similar pattern. Even though China is a totally different story, we have a very similar pattern of population growth and a river system that allows people to start growing their own food. And so, like I mentioned, the Yellow and the Yangtze River are going to be very important for China in its early history. So the Yellow River is kind of found in the northern part of China. It has a cooler and a drier climate than southern parts of China have, and so historically it makes a really good environment for wheat and millet farming. Wheat and millet are crops that tend to like things warm and dry, and so the Yellow River is a good environment for those crops. And again, this is one of the first places in China that we'll see an actual civilization develop. Okay, so here's the Yellow River in in North China. I believe the dots are all modern cities. I don't think that they are. Um, I don't think they're historical, but I'm not. To be honest, I'm not positive. So here's the Yellow River in China. You can see it starting kind of in the northern part of the northwestern part of China, goes all the way, and it empties into the Yellow Sea here, right? Good morning, Michael. So that's an important river system for early Chinese civilization, okay? Just to give you a little bit of a visual on what the Yellow River looks like, here it is. I'm not sure exactly where this picture is taken, but you can see it's actually quite yellow. So the river itself picks up a lot of silt, right? It picks up a lot of soil and sediment and debris, and that can change the color of the river. And so, but here you can see it's kind of a yellowy brown color. Here's another picture of the Yellow River. I suspect this is probably further toward the north than the west, but I'm not positive about that. And again, it's a very distinctive kind of golden brown color, right? The Yangtze River is located in southern China, okay? And so the Yangtze is a little bit different because the climate and the weather around it are much warmer and much wetter than it is around the Yellow River in the north. And so around the Yangtze River, we see very early on people starting to grow rice. Rice, of course, is a crop that grows much better in wet, warm conditions. And so in the south, in the Yangtze, people are able to build a civilization not so much based on wheat or millet, but on rice. And of course, rice becomes an important crop in the southern part of Asia. And of course, I think it even remains so. It remains an important crop today. And so that starts thousands of years ago. Yeah, and so here you can see the Yangtze River starting really far in the western part of China, finding its way south and all the way into the China Sea right by Shanghai. Yeah, and here's a couple pictures. So you can see the landscape and certainly the color of the river are a little different. So this is the Yangtze. Again, I'm not sure exactly where this picture is taken, but just to give you a bit of a visual on what this looks like if you don't know. So yeah, quite beautiful actually. And you can see in this picture here some of the terraced farming that people are doing. So you can see these sort of terraces here on the hill in the front, which maybe we'll talk about a little bit later. Okay, so climate. So in this area we have a temperate climate, but we also have a monsoon season. So in the summer we have fairly steady and fairly heavy rains in this part of the world. And so in the summer we have kind of warm, moist air moving in from the Pacific, and then in the winter we have colder, drier air coming in from Central Asia, okay? And again, because China is so big, you can have pretty significant temperature fluctuations from the really warm, wet, humid south to the northern part, which is much drier and much colder in the winter. In the south and in the east, because the climate is so much warmer and wetter, of course, it makes that area suitable to growing rice. And indeed, people start growing rice probably around 7,000 or 8,000 years ago. People start to domesticate rice. As it turns out, it's a lot of work, but you can grow a significant amount of rice on a small area of land. So it produces a lot of calories for you on a small area of land. And so it becomes worth it. It becomes worth the effort for those people in the southern part of China to start to grow rice. And of course, as we know today, rice continues to be an important staple of food in that part of the world. So yeah, we have these two rivers, the Yellow and the Yangtze, and those rivers are the foundation on which some civilizations are built. And so China's an interesting place because China has a large number of dynasties that establish themselves fairly soon. And so by about 2000 BC, so about 4,000 years ago, we have the first dynasties. And so a dynasty is a succession of rulers, a succession of kings, okay, that continues unbroken. And so maybe you have one guy who's a king, and then his son becomes king, and his grandson, and his great-grandson. And as long as that family remains in power, you have a dynasty, right? You have a collection of kings that are connected by heredity, right? They have father-son relationships usually. And then in some cases you have a dynastic change. And so a dynasty, a group of kings will either run out of people to make king, or you'll have a revolution, or someone will overthrow that king and that person will start a new dynasty. And so China, interestingly, has a collection of dynasties that go back, again, almost about 4,000 years, and almost unbelievably extend almost to the present day. And so the last dynasty, the king of the last dynasty, will be overthrown, or emperor, I guess. The emperor of the last dynasty will be overthrown in 1911, shockingly. So from about 4,000 years ago to 1911, which is amazing, you have almost this period of dynasty, of a line of kings followed by another line of kings, another line of kings. You have a few periods where things become decentralized and there's fighting amongst different parts of China. But for a huge amount of time, China is under dynastic rule, and it's kind of one dynasty after another. But we'll get to that. Oh yeah, so we'll come back to this a little bit later. This is just a bit of a preview. But you can see there is a line of dynasties dating back to the Shah, which is kind of probably the first dynasty in Chinese history, then to the Shang, then to the Zhou, the Qin, the Han, and it continues again all the way on to my pronunciation might be off here. The Qing dynasty? No, that's not how you say it. I forget how to say it. But that last dynasty ends in 1911, when we get the Republic of China, and then of course in 1949 Mao will be triumphant in his battle with Jiang Jieshi, or Chiang Kai-shek, however you want to say it. And Mao will create the People's Republic of China that still exists today. So in a similar way to India, China has a very long history, and one that is reasonably unbroken all the way to today, which is surprising, but also very intriguing and interesting. We'll come back to some of these dynasties a little bit later. But first, prehistory. So again, China starts out like a lot of areas of the world do before 10,000 years. So China is populated by hunter-gatherers, right? By foragers, by people who hunt for their food, they gather their food, they don't grow any crops, they don't have any animals except for dogs, and they move around the landscape hunting and gathering, living in small groups, not really having any permanent settlements or towns. And so, again, it's a very broadly similar way of life with the way most people are living for hundreds of thousands of years prior to about 10,000 years ago. But again, in a very similar pattern to Mesopotamia and Egypt and India, people eventually start to settle in one place by rivers, almost always, and they start to grow their own food. They start to practice agriculture. And so, yeah, prior to about 10,000 BC, East Asia was home to foraging, hunting, gathering peoples. But by about 8,000 BC, some of those people slowly start to stay in one place. They start to build more permanent houses and more permanent villages. They start to grow their own food. And once they do that, these little villages and these little sorry about the sirens there, guys. They're not coming for me, I swear. Over the next about 6,000 years, those little settlements, those little villages, slowly become more and more politically and socially complex, okay? And so, again, we don't know a lot about this period of history because, again, there's no writing, right? And again, that's another theme that I keep kind of hammering on, is that when we don't have writing from a particular culture, it really shuts us out to a lot of things that we might learn about them, and we might want to learn about them, right? We don't know what they thought, we don't know what they believed, we don't know the things that they said or did. All we have left is the archaeological remains, and so we have the stuff that's left behind from their behavior, and we have to try and figure out what they were like based on that, and that's not very easy. And so, based on what's been left behind, archaeologists have identified at least 8 major Neolithic cultures. And again, there's a difference between a real culture and an archaeological culture, but I think I'll just leave that. I'll leave that out, and you can discover it on your own another time. But one of these cultures was the Yangshao. And the Yangshao is a culture, a group of people living a particular farming lifestyle along the Yellow River. And so the Yangshao is kind of the first people that are living along the Yellow River. Gradually, they are replaced by the Longshan. And so this is the thing about archaeological cultures. We don't know if the Yangshao people were a totally different people than the Longshan, or if culture was just changing and developing over that time. And so I guess I will talk about it. Archaeological cultures are defined by groups of similar technology. So similar ways of making tools, similar pottery styles, similar types of housing, things like that. We don't really know anything about the people that use them. We just know that all of these items are similar and found together. So like the Yangshao, we have a group of similar pottery that is found with these people. And later, we find pottery that looks different, that's styled differently. And so we attribute that to the Longshan. Were those people actually genetically different people? We're not sure. That's the difference between an archaeological culture and a real one. Real cultures are often different people. Archaeological cultures are just different collections of material. And so we don't really know if they're different people or not. But either way, this kind of Yangshao culture is replaced by the Longshan around 3000 BC. So that's about 5,000 years ago. And again, what archaeologists are finding are evidence of walled towns. Okay, there's evidence of cemeteries, and there's also some public buildings and roads and drainage systems. Okay, one of the interesting things that's come out of this is, based on how the cemetery is arranged, based on how people are buried, and the things that are buried with them, some archaeologists are arguing that there is economic or social distinctions in these cities and in these cultures. And so some graves, people are buried with nothing, it's just their body in there. Some of them have fancy artifacts. And so here we're seeing, even in the Longshan culture, we're seeing some social stratification, right? Some social hierarchy. Some people have either more wealth or more power or more status than other people have, okay? And so we're seeing that in the cemetery. We're seeing that where people are buried, right? So based on what people are finding from the Longshan culture, archaeologists say that during this 3rd millennium BC, so around 5,000 years ago, people are starting to move from simple villages into walled towns, okay? So they're becoming more urban, right? They're starting to move to centralized kind of cities and live there. Those walled towns are going to protect people from others who might want to attack them. And again, we're seeing, over time, we're seeing more and more evidence of social stratification. We're seeing more and more social inequality. And we're basing that on the types of things that we find in graves. And so usually people who are more important, who are richer, who have more political or religious power, often those people are buried with more stuff, right? More valuables. And so we're seeing that here in this kind of Longshan culture that's along the Yellow River. We're seeing that over time, some people seem to be buried with fancier and fancier stuff, right? So we're seeing some people gain wealth and power in this stage of history. So that leads us to some of the first dynasties in China. And so the first 3 that occur here are the Xia, the Shang, and the Zhou, okay? And you can see that each one of them is around for a few hundred years. The Xia maybe around 300 years, the Shang maybe around 600 years, and the Zhou is in place for quite some time, for almost 700 or 800 years, right? So these are all dynasties, and again, dynasties are a line of kings that goes from father to son to grandson, on and on and on until, again, the family dies out, or until somebody overthrows them and becomes king from another family, and then you have the starting of another dynasty, okay? So we have these 3 dynasties very early in Chinese dynastic history. And so the Xia is one that seems to appear around 1900 BC, so around 4,000 years ago. It is probably, it is probably the first dynasty to appear in China, although it was a little bit controversial, this dynasty, for quite some time. The Xia dynasty has no writing associated with it. Okay, so we have nothing written down from this particular dynasty. The only way, prior to I think the 1960s, the only way we really knew about this culture was based on later writings. Okay, so what people in the Shang dynasty and the Zhou dynasty, what they said about the Xia. And so we didn't really have people's own words from the time. We had people later telling us about them. And so for a while, many historians and archaeologists thought that the Xia was made up, that it was mythical, that it didn't exist, that the Shang created this dynasty as a way to justify their own power, justifying their own rule. But then archaeologists started to find evidence of cities and villages that actually date to the time of the Xia dynasty. And so, but that there's still, I think, some confusion and some argument about whether those things actually represent the Xia or not. Because again, we don't have any writing from those archaeological sites, and the people who wrote about that dynasty lived maybe hundreds of years later. So for the Xia, it's not entirely clear whether it was real or whether it was made up, or whether it was real but then later writers kind of embellished it and shaped it for their own purposes. We're not really sure what was going on here. So again, we have some written accounts of the Xia that occur later, not from the same time. We have some archaeological evidence that dates to the time of the Xia, but we don't know if those two things are the same and how they're connected. So there's a little bit of mystery around this first dynasty of China, whether it's a mythical one or whether it's a real one, or whether it's a real one that has been sort of reimagined. Either way, or the records from the Shang dynasty tell us that the Shang overthrew the Xia, okay? And so the Shang is either the second dynasty of China, or if the Xia didn't exist in the first place, then it's the first one. It depends which argument you believe. There's a lot of there's some technological and scientific advances that occur with the Shang dynasty. The Shang become very good at casting bronze, and I'll try to find some really good pictures for you of some Shang bronzes. They're quite amazing. They invent a calendar. We have evidence of religious rituals, which I will talk about very shortly. And of course, the Shang begin to write. And again, that's an important development for us historians, because now when people are writing stuff down, we can tell what they think and what they believe, right? Prior to the Shang dynasty, there's no writing, and so we don't know what people were thinking and believing in that time. So the Shang is, whether it's the first or second dynasty, probably doesn't matter so much, but what does matter for us is that they start writing things down, and then we can actually start to learn things, okay? So as the story goes, the first king or the first emperor of the Shang dynasty, Tang, he begins to work for the good of the people of his country instead of his own pleasure and luxury, and provided a role model for his people. Now, this is kind of an important distinction between the Xia and the Shang, and it has to do with that whether the Xia is fictional or not. So the story that the Shang tell is that the Xia kings were corrupt. They were sort of morally corrupt. They were selfish. They were just doing whatever they wanted for their own pleasure. Again, they were acting immorally in a number of ways. And because of that, because those Xia kings were behaving so badly, the Xia kings lost what they called the mandate of heaven. Okay, and so the mandate of heaven seems to be something that the Shang made up. There seems to be no precedent for it. But the mandate of heaven means that somehow the power up there, the power of the universe, had given the Xia the power to rule over the people. But because the Xia kings were behaving so badly, the mandate of heaven was withdrawn from the Xia, and it was given to the Shang. And that's why the Shang dynasty kings are in charge. Of course, it was the Shang dynasty kings that were actually writing all this stuff down. So there was really no mandate of heaven. And it's not really clear whether the Xia dynasty believed in the mandate of heaven. And it's not really clear if the Xia dynasty actually existed the way the Shang rulers said that it did. So it's a bit of a confusing picture, and we kind of have to kind of take the word of the Shang writers that that's what happened. But either way, in the Shang story, the Xia kings were acting poorly. They weren't looking after the people. They were behaving in an immoral fashion. So because of that, they lost the mandate of heaven. They lost the power to rule the people. And that mandate was given to Tang, was given to the Shang kings. And so they are the ones who were the rightful rulers of China. That's the story anyway. And so Tang and his descendants in the Shang dynasty would continue to rule China for about 600 years. But eventually they will lose the mandate of heaven as well. So again, we have this creation of an idea of the mandate of heaven that justifies the reason why the Shang dynasty was in charge of China. But then when the Shang kings are overthrown by the Zhou later on, the Zhou say, oh, it's because the Shang dynasty kings, they lost the mandate of heaven. And so kind of every new dynasty will overthrow the old one and then say, oh, well, the other guys got overthrown because they lost the mandate of heaven. So there'll be this kind of ongoing pattern where people justify their own dynasty, they justify their own rule based on the fact that the last dynasty lost the mandate of heaven. Okay. So again, the Shang dynasty is a period of stability. We see a lot of cultural and technological development, and a lot of and stability for about 600 years. Some of what we know of the Shang dynasty comes from these oracle bones, and I don't know if you've ever heard about these or not. But we should probably, I think you know what bone... Dog. Hush, doggy. I know you know what bones are, but what's an oracle? Okay, so an oracle is usually a person or a group of people that you go to when you want answers from the gods. Okay, and so you usually go to the oracle. And you ask a question, and the oracle will give you an answer. Okay, so there's various ways in which the oracle can give you an answer. Sometimes it's a person and they'll just tell you an answer. Usually it's very enigmatic and sort of you have to interpret the answer for yourself. Sometimes there'll be some form of divination, and so they'll do something. Darn dog. So either way, the oracle is like an answer from the gods, okay? And whether it's a person or whether it's a thing, you'll go to a place, you'll ask a question of the gods, and hopefully you'll get an answer, okay? So that's what an oracle is. For the Shang dynasty people, when they wanted an answer from the gods or from the spirits or from the ancestor, from an ancestor, they would go to a temple and they would use bones. They would use cow bones. And so they would go to a place before the oracle, before a particular stone sculpture or wall, and they would ask a question, right? They would say, will it rain soon? Or if we attack this group of people, will we be successful, or will the gods help us? Okay. And then you apply heat to the bone. So you put the bone over the fire and the bone will crack. And based on how the bone cracks, that will tell you whether the god says yes or no to your question, right? So you can get a little bit of spiritual or divine help from the oracle by asking the god or the ancestors a question and then viewing how that bone cracks in the fire as either a yes or a no. And in many cases, the question and the answer was actually recorded on the bones themselves. And so there's lots and lots of these oracle bones that have been found in the archaeological record. I think this one is a scapula, so it's a shoulder bone from a cow, I believe. And so on this cow bone, we have some very early Chinese script here, and on the bone they have recorded the question that was asked of the god or of the ancestors, and probably the answer that the god gave. And so again, this is very interesting for us historians and archaeologists because we can figure out what people's culture and beliefs and values were by the kinds of things that they would ask the god, right? What kind of things did they value? What kind of things did they want? What kind of things did they not want? Um, we can see evidence of these in these oracle bones, right? Yeah, so from these oracle bones, one of the many things we've learned is that the Shang elites believed in a high god called Di, but they also believed in various nature gods, various other types of spirits, and of course, the fact that they could speak with their ancestors as well. And so, um, kings and elite members of the Shang dynasty would go to the oracle and ask questions of either the god or of the spirits or of their ancestors in order to help them out in everyday life, right? Yeah, so we said that the Shang dynasty here are overthrown by the Zhou. King Wu is the first one in the line of Zhou kings in about 1000 BC, so about 3,000 years ago. The Zhou will be followed by the Qin, which we'll get to a little bit later. And the Qin will eventually unify China and will give China its name. The Qin dynasty comes to name China as it is. But by the time we get to this period of history, so the Zhou dynasty and the Qin dynasty, for both of those, we have kind of the basic elements of Chinese culture are already in place, okay? And so those kind of basic continuities will continue all the way through. Okay, so we've been working hard. That's a lot of information for some of you. Some of you may know your Chinese history already, and so this may be totally boring for you, but I hope not. Let's take a little break, and when we come back, I have some reading for you to do. But let's take a break, stretch our legs, and I'll see you back here very shortly. Okay. Okay, people, and we're back. So, starting China, we have, again, a very long history going back, well, further than 10,000 years, but we're jumping in around 10,000 years and saying that we have hunter gatherers kind of roaming around, hunting and gathering, right? Around 8,000 years, it seems that people start to settle down in villages, they start to grow their own food, and from about 8,000 to maybe 2000 BC, we see that people are living in those villages and they're farming more intensively. Their social structure is becoming more complicated. Some people seem to be gaining more power and more status because they seem to be buried with more stuff. And finally, it seems like when we get to about 4,000 years ago, about 2000 BC, we have the appearance of the first dynasty, right? So we have an area of China that's under the control of one family, and that the first king of the Xia dynasty, his son becomes king after him, and then his grandson, and so on and so forth. And so then we start up this period of dynasties where families have control of a reasonably united China for, in some cases, hundreds of years, right? We said that the Shang dynasty is the very first dynasty that we have written records for. And so that's very important because it starts to tell us a little bit about what's happening in here, right? About what's happening in the sort of intellectual and religious lives of the Shang dynasty people. And the Shang also tell us a little bit about the Xia. But how much we should believe about that is difficult to know, right? Did they give us an accurate representation of what the Xia dynasty was? Or did they tell us about the Xia dynasty in a way that justified their own rule and their own power? It's not clear, right? And so eventually we see that the Shang dynasty is a period of stability where we have a succession of kings, son and grandson, and so on. And we have a lot of cultural and technological development happening as well. And so the casting of bronze and the calendar and things like that. We have lots of oracle bones, which I showed you, that tell us a little bit about what Shang dynasty kings and elites were asking for, right? What kind of things that they thought were important. And so that was important for historical knowledge. And then eventually we see that the Shang dynasty was overthrown by the Zhou. And again, the Zhou used the same justification for their rule as the Shang did earlier on. They said that the Shang dynasty has lost the mandate of heaven. They've lost the permission of heaven to have power over the people, to govern the people. And so now the Zhou are in charge, and they're in charge because they now have the mandate of heaven, right? So they kind of use this same idea of the mandate of heaven to explain to the people why they're in charge and why people should do what they say, right? Okay, so that sets up very early China and some of the dynasties that we hear about, and it sets up this dynastic sort of dynastic system that will continue, again, unbelievably, all the way to 1911. So I have a little section of the textbook for you to read. It's a little bit complicated. There's a lot of things going on. So you're going to have to read it a little bit slowly and try to pay attention to what's really being said, because it's a complicated section. There's a lot of things going on, okay? So I'm going to give you this section of the text. I'll put it and I'll put the questions into Microsoft Teams so that you have them very easily available to you. I'll give you some time to work on those, and then we'll come back and we'll deal with them as a group, okay? So just a second here. Just a second here. Just a second here. Okay, so I put this into Student Portal, so it's about a 4-page section of the textbook that I'd like you to read. And again, there's 5 questions to answer. And again, try to take your time a little bit with this one because it's again, it's kind of a tricky section. There's a lot of things. There's a lot of things happening. Okay, so I will give you. I'm gonna give you about. I'm gonna give you 25 minutes. Okay, so 25 minutes to read and answer these questions. Don't forget to type them out because if they're not typed, it'll be difficult to put them into live chat, right? Type them out. I'll see you back here. I'll see you back here at 11:30, and then we'll start talking about some of these questions. Again, I know it's a complicated section of the text, but I have faith in you guys. I know you can do it, okay? So, yeah, so look at Microsoft Teams. You'll see the section of the text to read and the questions are in there as well. And then I'll see you back here in 25 minutes and we'll talk about what we've read and what we've learned, okay? So go to it. Okay, people, and we're back. So I hope that section of the text was okay for you. I know there's kind of a lot. There's kind of a lot going on there, but let's see if we can pick through it and sort it out. Okay, so we said that we had the Jia dynasty first, and then we had the Shang dynasty, and then it's followed by the Zhou, and the Zhou dynasty rulers kicked the Shang rulers out, and they put 3 policies into place in order to kind of control this area of China. And so what did they do? Give me one of those. Give me any of those 3 things. Give me any of the 3 things that they do. Okay, so KC says, what do they do here? So they establish a secondary capital, right? So they move their capital city further east so they can keep a closer eye on the territories that are surrounding their the area that they have under their control, right? So they move their capital east in order to be more centrally located. What else does KC say? They issue a proclamation to conquered peoples of why they should accept Zhou rule. Yeah, so that's the question, of course, right? Is when the old king is kicked out and the new king appears, why should we listen to the new king? And the new king explains, right? And the new king uses that idea of the mandate of heaven, right? He says that the Shang rulers were morally corrupt. They were selfish. They weren't worried about the people. They were just taking care of themselves. And so they lost the power to rule because the mandate of heaven was withdrawn, and it was given to the Zhou rulers. And so you should listen to the Zhou, right? You should follow their commands. Yeah, so that was the second one. And then the third one, they dispatched kinsmen to locations for the purpose of establishing colonies. Yes. So actually I'm going to finish with that, and then I'm going to go to Tikas. So yeah, they sent their kinsmen, they sent family members off into the countryside in order to set up towns and rule the peasants that were around them, okay? And so these people kind of become nobles, right? And they, in the textbook here, they use words like dukes and things like that, and that's kind of an English term for what these people would have been. But again, they are members of the royal family. They're sent out into the countryside to set up a little town, a little castle maybe, and rule the people around them, right? And so Thika said that these people who were sent out into the countryside got to rule their lands freely as long as they obey the king, right? So the king is almost saying, so if I'm the king, I might say to my nephew, okay, nephew, go over to this area, set up a house there, and you will be the ruler, right? And over there, you're basically a king. You can kind of do what you want as long as you do what I say when I tell you, and as long as you send me money. I'll set you up there, and you get to be almost like a little king of your own, right? And so that's what happens with these nobles, right? The king sends members of his family out into the countryside. They're going to set themselves up as royalty in these areas, and they're going to control the people, the farmers, the peasants around them. Karen says, tell them all that it was the gods who chose them to rule. Yeah, that was the second one, right? So why should you listen to these new Zhou kings and Zhou rulers? Well, because the gods had granted them the power to rule. They'd given them the mandate of heaven, right? Okay, so the Shang kings are overthrown. The Zhou kings are in power. The Zhou king moves the capital further to the east. He sends out members of his family to kind of take charge of the countryside and make themselves into little mini kings all around the place. And of course, they justify their new power with this idea of the mandate of heaven, right? So the sort of political economic system that's being put into place here is something they call Zhou kinship feudalism. So what is that? What is Zhou kinship feudalism? That's a tricky one. Zhou kinship feudalism. So, all right, so KC says it's a political and economic system, okay, good, based on fragmented authority, okay, where a set of obligation between lords and rulers in exchange for some type of service. Okay, that is all good. Thika says it's a political and economic system, fragmented authority between lords and vassals, and grants land. Good. Those are both good. Do we have anything else to add to that before I kind of stitch those things together? Okay, if you're still putting in your answer, go ahead, don't worry. So the idea here is that the peasants, the lowly farmers, they are attached to the land. They kind of belong to the land and they farm the land. The Zhou kings send out their kind of royal relatives to rule over these peasants, and these little kind of mini kings, these little members of the royal family, they control the peasants. They tell them what to do, and the peasants give them part of their harvest, and part of that harvest and part of that money goes back to the Zhou kings, right? So basically, I don't know if you've heard this word before, but basically the Zhou kings are subcontracting their ruling to their relatives, and the relatives are just kind of in charge of being the king in that one little area. So they divide the power to a large group of people. They're subcontracting, right? And so each member of the royal family has their own little fiefdom. They have their own little feudal state. The peasants kind of belong to them, and the peasants farm and give part of their harvest to the noble person. The noble person sends part of that to the king and does whatever the king says, and everybody's happy, right? And the whole thing kind of remains under control. Actually, the peasants probably aren't that happy, but you know, the rulers tend not to worry about that. Good. That's exactly how that system works. But it doesn't work forever, right? Eventually, that system starts to fall apart and fail. And so, why does it fail? I think there's two reasons, right? But why does it start to fail? Why does it start to fail? Okay, so So Albert here says they suffered from a continual dilution of authority. That's true kind of in general. That's true in general. Casey says, Joe King's ability to control the lords failed over time, and their prestige also suffered. Okay. Thika says Joe King's the ability to control their lords diminished over time. Okay. Good. And their prestige. Okay. And the new rulers became independent. Yeah. So part of what's happening is that initially this system works out really well because all of the nobles that are sent to the countryside to rule, they're all family members, right? So again, if I'm the king and I send my nephew out to be the ruler of this little area, you know, on the other side of the mountain or something like that, he's my nephew, right? So he's loyal to me. We have a relationship, right? We know each other. He's going to do what I ask him to do, probably just because I'm his uncle. Never mind that I'm the king, right? So we have a fairly strong bond. But what starts to happen over time is that maybe I die and then my son becomes the king, and then maybe my nephew dies later and his son becomes the king. But those two sons are not as connected as me and my nephew were, right? And so then my son dies and my grandson is on the throne, and it's the grandson of my nephew ruling over the hill. But these two guys don't really know each other. They don't have a relationship. And so you can see as time goes on, the relationship bonds begin to be separated. And then finally, after, years and years, these two guys don't really know each other. They don't really have any kind of relationship. And so part of the reason why that Joe kinship feudalism was working because of the family relationship between people. But the longer it goes on, the less people are related, the less closely connected they are. And so, and so it's exactly what you're saying here, Aliana. The ties of kinship were crucial to maintaining control of this area. But as time went on, those ties became more separate, right? And so that's part of it. And I think Karen's got the second piece here, is that these new rulers became more and more independent, right? They saw themselves less as, a noble under their uncle, the king, as kings in their own right, right? And so the power differential started to equalize. And so the beginning of the Zhou period, you had the king of everything, and then you had all these nobles, but the nobles started to gain power, right? And they had less of a relationship with the king. And eventually they started to see themselves as equal to the Zhou king, and they started to ask, well, why are we doing what this guy says? Why can't we be the king of everything, right? Instead of just the king of our own little area. And so that leads us into the Warring States period. And so what happens during this period? What happens during the Warring States period? What happens during the Warring States period? So Aliana says that the Qin ruler eventually defeats the remaining states, and he unifies the former Zhou realm, initiating a new period in China's history. That is very true. KC says states battling for power and prestige, and after a huge number of wars, 540, that's a lot of wars, right? Only 15 states remained, and then at the end, only one remains. Thika says these states average a major battle each year, which in the ancient world is basically constant warfare. Ancient wars, this is an aside, but ancient wars are different from modern wars because ancient wars usually stop at certain times of year because people need to do farm work, okay? And so if the harvest has to come in the fall, if you don't do the harvest, if you don't collect the crops off the field, you're going to starve, right? So people might be engaged in a war and they might be fighting, but when it's time to harvest the crops, everyone stops, puts down their weapons, and goes home to harvest their crops. And so in the past, warfare was kind of only possible at certain times of the year, and so people would fight it out, and then they would kind of stop and go home and do their farming because they needed to. So it was kind of a it was a different way of fighting than we have now. But yeah, these states are basically in constant warfare, one a year, and eventually only one is left. And actually, Eliana, you've answered the last question there too. Is that a Qin ruler is the one who is able to defeat all of the states and unite the former Zhou China under the Qin, right? And so then again, we have this new period of centralization of power, right? So we have the Jia, we have the Shang, we have the Zhou. Under the Zhou, we have a period of stability, but eventually the way that the system is set up kind of falls apart, and these individual kings start fighting with each other, and eventually just a single state is able to get control of everyone, and that's under the Qin, right? Okay, whew. Okay, we did a good job. There's a tricky section of the text. There was a lot going on. There was some new terminology, but I think we nailed it. So don't forget tomorrow. Tomorrow's a holiday. Tomorrow's Canada Day, so there's no class tomorrow, so you can sleep in and relax. Yeah, and then come back on Thursday. We'll pick up China. We've got some other things to do later on in this week as well, which we'll take care of. But seeing as we're basically out of time, I will end it there. For those of you who were participating in the live chat, thank you very much. You did a really good job. Yeah, and I'll end it there, and I'll see you all on Thursday. Okay, so happy Canada Day. Enjoy yourself, and yeah, see you Thursday. Bye.